Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are at a second look at Ian Malcolm Chaotician. This deck comes to us again from Lexa, who has once again supported the channel to bring their deck to the front of the queue. Thank you so much, Lexa. Your support is always appreciated. They say, here's another look at Ian Malcolm. I've decided to go heavy into the craft cards as they exile and then return to their owner's control, as per rules of craft, so they are cards I get more value than my opponent, much like Jin Gitaxias that I suggested last time. Not sure if this is the right move, but it makes sense in my head. Keep up the good work. Excellent, we will definitely take a look at that and see how craft works in it, while also doing a general look at the cards. And also, I think we'll start it off with another deep dive into looking at our commander. But in slight other news, a little update, I'm changing jobs. Come in the new year, I'm switching from one job to another, so there might be a bit of a disruption in how my, let's say, filming schedule and how many videos I can put out a week. It might be a little bit, but we'll definitely find a groove that we're all happy with. So come in the new year, we might see some changes. But until then, let's get at it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So, Ian Malcolm Chaotician. What do they do, and what makes them kind of tricky for me? Well, last time I talked primarily as this card as Jeff Goldblum, but I'm just going to say Ian Malcolm this time, just to keep things fresh. So Ian Malcolm is a 2/2 for 3 human scientist with two really important abilities. The first one says that whenever a player draws their second card each turn, that player exiles the top card of their library. And it says, and the second text is, during each player's turn, that player may cast a spell from among the cards they don't own, exiled with Ian Malcolm. And mana of any type can be spent to cast them. So how does this work? Well, this primarily works with the idea that as the game develops, and with a lot of different wheel effects or additional draw effects, players are going to start exiling cards off the top of their deck. And then on each player's turn, they are going to look through all of the cards that are exiled with Ian Malcolm that don't belong to them, they don't own it, and they're going to pick one to cast. Now, this is a may, right? This isn't something that needs to happen. However, I'm going to suggest that this is something going to happen a lot. Mainly, if you thought about it in the sense that if you had a card that would draw 3 cards off your opponent's deck, so 1 card off each of your opponents, let's say per turn cycle, and those cards are held for you for as long as your commander's out, and you can cast from them a spell a turn. You're probably going to cast a spell per turn, right? Like per one of your turns, one of those spells, because one, the amount of spells you have is just going to keep growing. If we're just following the same logic, 3 for the first turn cycle, 6 for the second, 9 total, -1 each time if you're casting it, but still that's a lot of cards that you have access to. And I'm going to say that the odds of finding a card you'd like to cast off of that each turn cycle is pretty high. Now, let's think about the free cards for sure. So cards like Mana Ramp is going to be pretty free to cast off of Ian Malcolm for sure, because every single one is a little bit of ramp. All of a sudden, colors that don't have access to as much ramp, so let's think like blue, white, especially those two, especially monocolored decks that aren't green, are going to have a really hard time getting a good amount of ramp. So Ian Malcolm just allows you to start playing that ramp and getting further ahead. And this will also allow you to cast bigger spells off Ian Malcolm turn after turn. So ramp is pretty fast. And then after, I would say removal is also something you're probably going to cast if it shows up, right? Any form of Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, Lightning Bolt, any of that low mana Nature's Claim, you're probably going to cast it because it's very, very valuable. Same goes for things like Tutors, and otherwise I would probably say some draw cards, but not very many, because you don't really need the draw when you're gaining so many cards off Ian Malcolm. So you kind of have a priority, so you're going to be casting every single turn. After which, something to consider is that there is actually competition over these cards, right? Because these are limited to the active player's turn, the instantness, let's say, of some spells aren't going to be very, very important, right? So something like Swords to Plowshares, you're basically going to play it as a sorcery because once it stops being your turn, you no longer have access to it, and another player does. So if there's good cards in the pile, you're going to want to get them as fast as possible. So I think a really good example would be like Swords to Plowshares is flipped off of, let's say, my deck. My other 3 opponents are going to be very, very keen on using that as soon as possible, because when they don't, that card threatens to be used against one of their creatures. So there's a bit of a competition over these cards. So all of this to say is there's a really, really like aggressive battling over the cards that Ian Malcolm flips. And that is going to be kind of the theme of the game. Now, this might not be true in really, really low power pods, but outside of that, I think that's probably what's going to happen. Now, that brings us the other thing that I really want to talk about Ian Malcolm, and I swear we're going to get to the deck in a second. And I think I kind of said this last time, but I do want to reiterate it. One of the things that makes Ian, besides that first part of how to build Ian Malcolm is kind of difficult because you're creating this kind of new type of game. The other thing that makes Ian Malcolm really, really hard to build is that all of your tools can be used against you. So in decks like this, we have a lot of pieces that like benefit from having Ian Malcolm and the support Ian Malcolm needs to grow stronger. So a really, really easy example, right, would be something like the Locust God. The Locust card is a really strong card. It says whenever you draw a card, you get a 1/1 hasty creature. Now, obviously, this works really well with Ian Malcolm style cards because we're getting a bunch of extra draws and we're trying to leverage them against our opponents. And so having Locust God just allows us to gain a little more advantage every single time. Now, Locust God has a built-in kind of fail-safe here, but we're just going to ignore that for a second. Let's just look at the first part of it. Locust God is so good in your deck, but if it gets flipped off of Ian Malcolm, it's just as good against you, because the kind of mechanics you're introducing in the game make Locust God good on the battlefield. As long as a player has control over the Locust God, they're going to gain a lot of flying insects. So Locust God is a good example, like a good use of this kind of card, because you can just destroy it and you will gain back like control of it, which is really nice, but it's still kind of a threat once it's down, and your opponents are really keen of taking that from you. That's also like not including something as simple as Irecrag Pyromancer, who says on your second draw, she'll send a bolt at something, right? This card is also just as good in any of your opponent's hands because you're trying to get people to draw their second cards. So what I'm trying to get at here is when we're building Ian Malcolm, a lot of the cards that we use to accentuate or to establish our board presence or get more advantage out of our deck are just as powerful in our opponent's hands. So at the end of this video in my additions, I'm going to have some suggestions to kind of flip the script on them, but they are kind of aggressive suggestions that kind of change how the deck plays. So I'm going to kind of give my answer to this a bit later. Sorry for burying the lead, but we're going to do that. But for people who want to play this as a wheel deck or as a chaos deck, this is a hurdle that they're going to have to get through. All right, all that has been said. Let's take a look at the deck itself. Now, since the last time, I do like the changes here. I remember last time there was a bunch of exclamation points due to all of the new cards from Doctor Who and stuff that no one had seen before. So we've got a little more, a little more knowledge on some of these cards, and I think the deck has gotten a little cleaner. We've gone from 34 to 35 lands. I'm hoping per draft we're going to add a land. So I'm hoping by the end of this draft we'll go up to 36. I would really, really love that. I think even with a deck that draws this many times, at least 36, because that's just, like, for example, I find that 36th land is probably going to be more valuable than this Mind Stone, for example. There's this thing where we lower our number of land. Okay, so if anyone's been doing deck building, there's been this idea that your land ramp plus your lands should add up to like 40 plus, right? And I think that's a good idea, but like obviously if I said you have 10 lands and 30 plus mana rocks, you'd be like, cursed, that's not what I want to do. But that idea still somewhat stands the further we wheel that slider back and forth, right? We still need a good number of lands over mana rocks. Mana rocks aren't free to play. They're accelerants, but they have a limit on their usefulness because we are spending our turns playing them. So mana rocks do have a limit to at what point they're going to stop being as strong as just another land drop. So we just got to find some kind of balance there. And I think just going one more, even just cutting the Mind Stone, will be an easy change. So looking back at our curve is really nice. Obviously, our 9 mana card is Blasphemous Act. We have a few 7 mana cards. One of them has Foretell. And we have a few 6s, 5s, 4s, 3s. With 2 mana being the highest, which I don't mind. So I do like the curve. I think it's doing really well. I think I do have, let's look at a few of the cards here to see what stands out to me as being particularly good or somewhat suspect. As I always like to, I want to go straight to the highest mana stuff because that's where I'm going to try to reduce the mana cost of the deck. So Sage of the Beyond, I really like Sage of the Beyond here. I didn't check if this was in the first draft, and if I've said this before, I'll say it again. This is a really good addition. This is really well thought out because it kind of does the thing that is really beneficial in a Chaos deck, where, you know, as I kind of implied at the start, our opponents are getting the advantage we're getting, but we need to find a way to get the advantage more than them. And Sage of the Beyond is a really good example because it is a 7-cost card, which makes it really tricky to cast off of Ian Malcolm. However, for the player who owns this card, which is in their hand, you can foretell it, dividing that 7 mana into a 2 and a 5, making it much more reasonable. And this reducing the cost of cards at least by 2 generic, when they are off of Ian Malcolm, I really like. I think this is a really good inclusion. At the fact that I'm just going to consider this a 2 mana card for most of the game, and then you flip it when you have the advantage, I really like this. Nice and easy. Flaming T-Rex. This one's harder because this is just a 7 mana card. Now, this is a particularly scary 7 mana card, but I will say it's still one that catches me as a little weak, right? It has one of those things where it's a very high mana card that a lot of things have to go right in order for it to be useful. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start with this. At base level, it is a 7 mana 5/5 menace. Though that's not bad, that's also nothing to write home about. Like an evasive 5/5 for 7 mana, you can usually do a lot better. And menace isn't as good as flying, which is usually what we see. So let's look at the next ability, Paradox. Every time you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, this does 3 damage and then put a +1/+1 counter. So this one's interesting because it feels like a mix. Like it feels like Irecrag Pyromancer, where you're gonna get a bolt like once per turn cycle at least. Now granted, Irecrag will probably get you more than once per turn cycle, but Flaming Tyrannosaurus will probably only get you that bolt once because it's when you cast that spell out of your hand. So with that in mind, that's a bolt a turn, and then you slowly grow this creature. And then finally, this is a dies trigger at the end. And I think I do like that it's each opponent, but we don't have ways to sacrifice this creature, and we are increasing the odds that our opponents draw Path or Swords to Plowshares, or even O-Ring and the like. So with that in mind, I feel like this is like not better than the sum of its parts. As I say sometimes, if this creature was divided into like 3 creatures, and the mana cost was appropriately divided, I would probably use one of those creatures, probably this one with Paradox. But as it stands now, a 7 mana card with this kind of effect is not really what I want to do. 7 mana is like finish the game mana, and this doesn't finish the game. You just slap this creature down and you feel like, ooh, cool, I'm gonna get some value out of it eventually, right? Something else I think that bears being said is the idea that every single one of our cards, we can add like a +2 to 3 mana imaginary cost. Why is that? Where, as mentioned before, we're going to want to be casting the cards off of even Ian Malcolm every single turn. So in order to use Flame, like when we look at Flaming T-Rex, we can be like, hey, wouldn't it be great to cast it and then use its Paradox right away for a bolt? Yeah, it would. But you already want to be doing that with every single one of those cards because you want to be casting off of Ian Malcolm turn after turn. So this 7 mana becomes even more a liability when you realize you might need you might need 8-9 mana so you can still cast something else that turn. So overall, I don't particularly like this card. Locust God is great. As mentioned before, I think it has a really nice solution to its own problem. So, Keeper of Secrets. I have a hard... So this card is built for like a Storm deck, right? Or maybe not Storm, like a Storm, not Storm as the ability, but Storm as the deck type, where you play this card and you want to cast as many spells in a turn as possible. This has a similar plan to how the T-Rex works, where its middle ability is just burn one opponent at a time, and this isn't even any target. This is one opponent, and it's based off CMC. Okay, overall, I just don't like this. Even with the first strike haste, this is a very, very clunky creature. I think you're turning a lot of the really good spells that you want are like low mana, right? Imagine you use Nature's Lore, and you only get to do 2 damage, and you only get to do 2 damage to an opponent. Whereas the T-Rex, you at least, no matter what, get the 3 damage, and it's to any target, which is much more useful to take out creatures. So I will say, the existence of Keeper of Secrets makes me like the Flaming T-Rex a lot more. So if you really do like this ability, I would recommend just playing the T-Rex over that, because it's going to do better. 12th Doctor's great. Mizzix. Let's see. I don't mind this as much. 5 mana is a lot better to put this creature down. 2 additional mana to copy a spell. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't mind this, but it really does feel like a lot of our high mana stuff requires even more mana. So Mizzix, Keeper of Secrets, Sage of Beyond, not Sage of Beyond, Flaming T-Rex, and even to an extent, Locust God. All of this high mana stuff, even Jin Cataxias, I'll say, all of this high mana stuff has this kind of clause to it, where we're going to drop it, and then it's really going to benefit from us playing another really big spell. Sorry, not necessarily big, but another important spell from Ian Malcolm. And then either we're spending the mana to cast that spell, and then with like Mizzix, we're paying another 2 to copy it. So, funnily enough, Mizzix becomes 7 mana if you want to do it on the same turn. And then we have the same T-Rex problem, where we have a 7 mana card to cast another card off of. Like, it's interesting. These cards are really good in terms of like long-term value. But a lot of the things we're casting anywhere other than your hand are Ian Malcolm spells. Like we don't have a ton of cast from exile cards, right? We have that Foretell card. And I imagine we might have, we have another Foretell card here. Okay, so we don't have tons, but like we have a few. Otherwise, we're only getting the benefit off of, I guess, the battle as well is another example. But we're only getting the bonus off Ian Malcolm for these cards. So all of our like high mana cards all kind of act the same. I think Locust God is just a little different, but does still benefit if we can like cast a wheel right after. But the rest of them are all the same kind of play this creature. Hopefully you have a ton of mana to dump into another card, or you have to wait a turn cycle to kind of, to get the benefit from. And Mizzix, and they all come with some kind of evasion, menace or flying. Keeper of Secrets has first strike haste. That's at least pressure, I would say. And so with that in mind, like 12th Doctor as well, right? Like these all have these abilities. So I'm going to be really hard on them. I'm going to say, let's cut them down really, really aggressively. And I think my neutral opinion, before I go into the cards I want to add, is that you want just some cards that just do stuff. Just ETB do stuff. I really, really like Sage of the Beyond, where it's just better for you because you have a cheaper way to cast it. So it's not as much of a costly thing when your opponents draw. But I just want a card that just does something. This could be to take another card, a turn card, which is a foretell one you can use. This could be like, I don't know, another Wrath, a creature that just creates a huge board presence. Something that that when you play it, it does what you want and you don't need to combo with the rest of your cards. Because a lot of your cards are like this. And I really, really do like a lot of the lower mana ones. Like Fairy Mastermind is obviously incredibly strong in this deck. But on the other hand, something like Flaming T-Rex, Keeper of Secrets, these are just too much mana to do what they're doing. We need a little consistency. We need something that does what it means to do. And if you're only going to keep one, which you could probably keep more than one, the 12th Doctor, I think, is the strongest one. Because one, it's the most chaotic one. Demonstrate is really, really cool. But two, if someone else gets this, you might still get the Demonstrate. So that's pretty good. But I think 12th Doctor is definitely the strongest one, because also notice it's not like Mizzix where you need more mana to get that ability off. You play the 12th Doctor for 5, and then you just cast what other spell you want. The Demonstrate is also optional, so you don't have to go into it, but something like we said Nature's Lore before, 12th Doctor into Nature's Lore is 7 mana, and that's 2 basics onto the battlefield with Demonstrate, which I think is really, really good. So, I forget if you get the 2 copies in a row. When you cast that spell, you may copy it. If you do, choose an opponent to also copy. So they'll get the first one and you'll get the next 2. Okay, so that might be important for removal and stuff. That's important to remember. But otherwise, really, really, I really like the 12th Doctor. So that's the one I would keep. Looking at the rest of the deck, I'm generally really, really happy. A lot of the wheels are really good cards. We're going to talk about craft in a second, but the rest of the deck, I think, is really strong. So let's quickly talk about craft, and then we'll go into my additions. So the thing with craft, because we're looking at craft like we're looking at Jin-Gitaxias, and I think that's really, really good in the way of saying craft cards and Jin-Gitaxias style transform cards are very, very strong because your opponents are only going to get half the card. It's a different way of looking at things like Sage of the Beyond, which says it's much harder for your opponents to use this. Jin-Gitaxias says, your opponent can use this, but if they do, they're not getting the full power of it. They're only getting the first half, and they don't have access to the Great Synthesis. Now, something that's really important to note, craft works the same way: exile and return it under its owner's control. I know our deck builder wasn't thinking this, but for people who might be thinking, who go, wow, someone's going to craft and I'm going to get the card back. No one's going to do that. No one's going to give you this card by crafting it. So you just basically have to erase that second half of the card. No one's going to flip the Great Synthesis onto your side of the field. And I'm going to suggest in terms of good sportsmanship, sportspeopleship, I don't know if that word has a non-gendered way, but if someone flips the Great Synthesis that you own on their side of the field, goodness, please tell them, stop them and undo it. Don't let them do that. Don't let them do that. That's so heartbreaking. Like, maybe if you're playing something competitive, but I mean, this isn't CEDH, but like, you know, if you're playing with a stranger who's new and they flipped in Cataxias with Ian Malcolm and you're not playing MTGO, you know, just say, hey, I think you misunderstand what's going to happen. Please read the card. Let's undo that, because otherwise you're going to win the game for me. Would be my argument, but you're all your own people. You can do your own stuff. So with that in mind, looking at the craft cards, are these cards we really want? And the problem is I have a really hard time saying yes. So I think like the Eye is the best example, because it's a card that just naturally you want to play. You have very little downside to it. The Pickaxe even, I think, is fine. But like, even Inverted Iceberg is just fine. So I would probably play Inverted Iceberg and the Eye to begin with. And then the Hulk and the Pickaxe, I would be a lot harder on, right? The Waterlogged Hulk is just not very, sorry, the Watertight Gondola is just not good. You know, like, it's a 4/4 that can attack each turn. This is not a combat deck. I guess you can crew it with Ian Malcolm. That's nice. The Descend is probably not going to trigger often, so you don't worry too much about it. Is that better than the mill, just like, than the front side just mill a card? Yeah, don't. I guarantee if you exile this off of Ian Malcolm, your opponents are not going to go, oh no, I can't use the craft. They're just not going to cast this. This is just going to be a dead card. So if your opponents don't want to cast this card, that's a sign that you do not want to play this card, is my opinion. So I would cut that. Inverted Iceberg is fine. Pickaxe is it's fine. It's just a lot of work, I would say, because you got to get it onto a creature in a deck that you don't have a lot of good attacks early on. So it's kind of tough to get this going. But the Eye is good. Iceberg is fine, I would say. Those are the ones I would use for sure. Something that I think is worth noting, right? Do battles work the same way? I believe they do, right? Invasion, let's grab one of them. When it's defeated, exile it and cast it, then cast it transformed. When sieges, I'm just checking if anyone else. I feel like other players can use this, right? It doesn't go back to its owner, right? Let's do that. It's already in battlefield, becomes a copy of Siege. The controller chooses one of their opponents. Okay, that doesn't matter. Okay, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Okay. Okay, so with that in mind, sieges don't work like... I wasn't sure. I thought that maybe they work like the crafts. So unfortunately... I was going to suggest to go into sieges a little bit to cover them. It looks like it's not the case. So I see the cards that you were thinking of craft. I don't know if there's better ones. I really don't think so. Craft is a very interesting mechanic. And I would honestly argue, I think some of the best ones are in black. But these ones are just okay. I think, once again, the Eye and the Iceberg, you're probably pretty happy to play with. And sometimes you'll get the other side. And these are cards your opponents will play with too, and they might actually feel like they're not getting the upside of it. So let's get back to what we want to do. And what we want to do is this. We want to look at additions, right? So let's get to some additions. And I'm going to have some generic additions, and then after which I'm going to talk at length about an idea that I have that might be really aggressive and might change the deck a lot. But I think you could use parts of it pretty well. So let's talk about additions. Something I may have said last time, and I'm going to say again, Oblivion Sower is just a card that I would definitely play here, because it kind of solves the problem of what I was saying, where you sometimes just want a 6-mana card that you're just happy to play. And Oblivion Sower is that. It's not too backbreaking if one of your opponents gets access to it, but it's really, really good if you do, right? And that's mainly because the ramp you're going to get out of this is going to be very, very good. On cast, you get 4 extra cards into the graveyard, into the exile, sorry. And then ideally, off of Ian Malcolm, you have picked the opponent who already has the most lands in exile, and you're going to get all of those lands into play. Really do like that. I think it's very strong. I think it's an easy addition, if not somewhat, like, a little flashy, I would say. Another one that's interesting to me, although I did just see the price tag. Geez, that's expensive, but I do understand why. I'm still going to put it down here anyways, is Passionate Archaeologist. So it says, commander creatures you own have, whenever you cast a spell from exile, this creature deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to target opponent. So isn't this neat that this card is basically the demon, the keeper of secrets, but so much better? And the only, besides the price, I will say, the only thing that it needs is that your commander's out. And in order to use your ability, your commander needs to be out. So with that in mind, like, this is just perfectly set up. It feels like the perfect answer to these kind of cards that we have. However, or I would say in addition, your opponent's gaining control of this card is not the same thing. And I'm going to note it for a few reasons. The first reason is a lot of decks will not have access to more cast from exile than you do, or are dependent on you having that. So if one opponent is getting out of control, right, you can just get rid of, like, Ian Malcolm could just be off the field, and all of a sudden this card is dead on their side. And then, of course, on the other side, they need their commander in play. So there's even more of a way that this card is dead on your opponent's side of the field. So all in all, I think this is like the perfect card for the deck. It is expensive. I'm sorry, I didn't see that, but I still want to suggest it as being really, really strong. I think it's very, very cool. And I think it's going to be like a really good version of those other effects. Here's another one that I've been thinking of. So we were talking about these exile cards such as Jin-Gitaxias. I was looking at Urabrask, I was looking at other options, and I was trying to find something that works in the fact that you get even less, like your opponent gets almost no benefit from it, whereas you get the full benefit from it, or if you can force your opponents to give you the other side. Remember when I said, like, if someone flips Jin-Gitaxias, you should stop them. But what about something that only is useful if they can flip it? And that's Jace Vern's Prodigy. This is a card that I will say that used to be very, very expensive and has dropped very, very aggressively in price. So I do really like it. But this card only does anything if they are risking the fact that you might get it. Now, if they have no cards in the graveyard, they can use this, pretty easily for a few turns. But if they want to loot later in the game, this card, if they loot with it, it comes back onto your side of the battlefield. Now, that's not perfect because they have control over it, and because it's a planeswalker, when it's not your turn, you don't get to do anything with Jace, so they can either use politics or have a good attack where they can set up a situation where they'll give you Jace and they'll knock Jace out of the game right after that. But if you ask me, I'm going to be honest, that's kind of a fine deal, right? Like, not only is this good because they have to put a lot of effort in for you to not get that card, but otherwise, they're just not going to cast this creature. So it's perfectly fine to exile it with Ian Malcolm, and you're not going to mind too much. And of course, as mentioned before, this looting will trigger Ian Malcolm. You have a lot of instants and sorceries you don't mind flashing back, and the ability to do so. I think this is a really, really good inclusion. This definitely feels like it belongs in the deck, and I think you'll do very, very well with it. Another card that really interested me is Mystifying Maze. So Mystifying Maze is interesting because, once again, this is a way to get our creatures back that our opponents control, or to change creatures that our opponents control, like who they belong to, the ones that have been cast off Ian Malcolm. because what this does is it lets you exile attacking creatures in opponent's control, and at the beginning of the end step, it'll return under its owner's control. So if they attack with like Locust God, which when this is out they shouldn't, but let's say they do, or they have to, you can get that Locust God back by exiling it and bringing it back to your side of the battlefield. But this is also very likely to work on any creature your opponents attack with. If opponent A is attacking with opponent's B creature and you don't want them to have that creature anymore, you can give it back to opponent B. Like, there's not a lot of examples that you really want that, but it is an option in your tool belt to move these creatures around. And remember, I think my favorite part of this is that your opponents don't even have to attack you with your own creatures. They just have to attack with your creatures. And so with that in mind, you can definitely get your creatures back really, really easily and really benefit from it. So at 70 cents, at the fact that it's a land, I think this is just a free inclusion. I think it's really strong, and you will definitely get people with this for a while. And once your opponents kind of, they figure it out, because it's like Homeward Path, right? Eventually they're gonna smarten up about how it's being used. The thing is that they're still like, then they don't attack as long as you have open mana. And 5 open mana is a lot, but it's still something that should be considered. So I think overall, this is a really free inclusion. And something I forgot to say, but I think it's pretty evident, Ian only lets you cast spells. You can't play lands off of Ian Malcolm. So Mystifying Maze cannot be played by your opponents and used against you, which I really, really like. All right, so we're slowly transitioning to my idea that I'm going to give in. But first, I was thinking of, okay, so some of the cards I really do like here are cards that, like Folio Fancies, Howling Mine, Teferi's Puzzle Box, where they benefit our idea, like our game plan, no matter whose side they are on. So Temple Bell is a really easy inclusion here at a low price that just says, there's a very high chance your opponents will trigger this and you'll keep drawing cards. People will keep drawing their second cards and exiling, the top card of their deck. This is kind of free. It's very much like Howling Mine. But then I got to thinking and saying, like, well, first of all, smart opponents won't tap this, or they'll know how to tap this in a way that benefits them. So let's just cut that out and go straight for Font of Mythos that says at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws 2 additional cards, which is perfect because that guarantees, well, I guess it guarantees either with just the Howling Mine, but for sure you're going to get an Ian Malcolm trigger off of them on that turn. This one is a bit pricier, but it's really great. Doesn't matter whose side this is played on, you're going to be very happy with this effect. Something to note that I will say for these, specifically Font of Mythos and and Howling Mine, is that these cards are actually better if your opponents cast them. One of the really big downsides of these kind of effects is that you get and I think this is even including Teferi's Puzzle Box. Yeah, so you get these effects last when you play them, right? You play them, and then the next time you have a draw step is after everyone else's draw step. But if one of your opponents plays this, it's unlikely it's the opponent that's right before you, but no matter who plays it, you are still going to get that ability faster than you would if you played it. And that's really cool. So I really like that little bonus you get that kind of puts these cards out there, incentivizes your opponents to play them, because who doesn't like card draw? And then when they do, you're actually happier that they cast it. So these function as kind of traps that you do get to still play in your main deck as good cards. So really, really like that. Another one that's a lot more aggressive is Horn of Greed. Horn of Greed is even stronger and traditionally, right, works the same way as Howling Mine, because it's not a it's not landfall. It's plays a land, which you can only do on your own turn. And so with that in mind, this is almost guarantees, right? If they play a land, that's their second card draw, and you're going to get the Ian trigger off of that. So really, really do like this. This one's a little better for whoever plays it on the turn, because they don't need to wait a turn cycle, but it is an interesting card as well. I will also say that this does have a bit of an issue with opponents that are land decks, but then that might not be the worst, right? Land decks tend to really rely on their graveyard to get their lands back, so exiling their cards is not nothing. Land decks tend to use like a lot of really key pieces, and losing one or two of them, you know, per turn, like per turn cycle, can make a big difference. So I would have to see it in play, but I think it would work pretty well against them too. Then I do have other suggestions for land decks anyways. And then the last one I wanted to just kind of throw out here is Possibility Storm. Possibility Storm is just one of those cards that works really well in Chaos. Doesn't matter if you cast it, doesn't matter if your opponents cast it, you're going to be pretty happy with the ability. I'm just putting this out there as the more Chaos side of the deck, which is an angle to play this deck. Will your opponents cast this for you? I don't think so, but I will note that it doesn't matter who casts it. So this is still pretty good. All right, let's transition to my thoughts. And I'm going to leave this for you to decide, Lexa, of how much you want to play. But some of these I think are really, really good and I think are worth playing. And some of them, not so much. Some of them you kind of have to go further in. So what's the thought here? Well, the thought here is, okay, I started looking past these and I started looking at Mana Flare as a card an enchantment that everyone gets the effect no matter where it is. And I thought to myself, I want more of these, but I want ones that still give us the most benefit no matter where they are. And I also want cards that your opponents, that like maybe not all three of your opponents wants to play, but one of them will definitely want to play. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at our poster child, Blood Moon. Now, Blood Moon's a card that I just really like in Commander, especially in decks that are 2-color with red, but you know, you could play this in 3-color decks as well. It's just an insanely powerful card that really punishes your opponents for not planning their decks out well and just going overdoing the, either they're not playing enough removal or they're relying too heavily on their non-basics. Now, I'm going to say, full disclosure, I'm guilty of that too. When I see people and they have decks where they have like 20 plus basics, I tend to tell them like, you should probably play a few less basics. But here's the answer to that. Play as many basics as you want, but also play Blood Moon. So not only is this just going to be really good against the majority of your opponents, there's also a really fun dynamic here. Let's say we're sitting in a circle, right? Our opponents are 2 3-color decks and like your 2-color deck, and I'm on like Ashnod. We flip your Blood Moon off of Ian Malcolm. 2 of your opponents are like, I don't want to cast that. I'm like, absolutely. I'm in mono black. I have a bunch of swamps. I really, really want to get this on the battlefield, and therefore you've guaranteed me casting it because it hates out 2 of my opponents. Now, important to note that these mana, like Blood Moon effects, which I will note another one down here as Magus of the Moon, or Magus of the Moon, they do have limitations because Ian Malcolm allows you to tap for any color for the lands off of Ian Malcolm. So your opponents will still have spells to cast, even if all of their lands are mountains and they're like, I don't know, blue-green. But that's also fine because there is an actual limit to the number of cards and types of cards that are accessible, and you've locked them out of the cards that work, you know, with their deck. If they were going to cast 3 spells a turn, they might be only able to cast 1 off of Ian Malcolm, and that's fantastic. So both of these, I think, are really, really easy inclusion. One that's close is Blood Sun, and the reason is Blood Sun is a little trickier. It turns off utility lands, and it keeps the mana, which I think in this setup, you might have to think about your lands a little more in order to take advantage of this, but it is really good against certain decks, especially decks that are really, really keen on fetches in multiple colors. But it also gives whoever draws it gets to draw whoever plays it gets to draw a card, which is actually kind of good because it'll trigger Ian, but it is something worth considering. Like it's more valuable for someone to cast than like Blood Moon, where only one of your opponents wants to cast. So this is interesting, but it requires a little more thought into pods and what's around. Then something that's, once again, a little aggressive but really interesting is Price of Glory. Price of Glory is a classic kind of red hate on blue card where it says whenever lands are tapped for mana during other players' turns, you destroy that land. Once again, one of your opponents is likely to want this in play. Two of your opponents or one of your opponents probably really doesn't want that in play. Any blue opponent is going to, like, that based on counter magic, is going to be not that keen on it. But that's fine. You're perfectly fine with that because the trade-off is going to be really good. You have a card in play. You're now at sorcery speed, so your counter magic isn't as good, and that's fine. I'm really, really willing to hate on these two cards and a little bit on these cards in general in order to get ahead against all of your more control-y or instant speed or flash opponents. So this one I think is really, really good as well. And the stacks don't stop. Next, we have Back to Basics. Now, Back to Basics has an even more hated kind of reputation because at least the Blood Moon Mountains you get to tap. Back to Basics, you do not. So once again, this one's harder. I think usually it's rare to have an opponent that's really gonna want to cast this. And of course, these cards require you to rebuild your deck a little bit, which is why I'm just suggesting them and I'm not saying they need to go in there. But if you can build around this and one of your opponents doesn't mind, you pretty much win the game when this is cast. And another one, once again, very much so on the stacks plan, is Ruination. Anyone can cast Ruination. Anyone. And it'll have the same effect. And definitely there's going to be boards, especially with a land player around or a 4-color player around, that this is just going to be devastating for them. And I think there'll be a lot of players who are like willing to lose like 4 out of their like 6 lands if it completely puts the land player who has like 16 lands out of the game, right? They will cast this any day, or they should at least. So with that in mind, I think this is another one that's going to be really easy to play, and you just need to adjust your land base a little bit. Something that's a few cards that are a little softer would be like Mana Barbs and Sulfuric Vortex. Once again, cards that are really aggressive, and it doesn't matter who has them. Now, these you kind of depend on having an aggro player around, but you're probably going to have an aggro player around, and they will definitely cast these spells for you if they get flipped. And for you, you might have to rebuild your deck to be a little more aggro-centric to get away with this, but not too much that your opponents never want to cast this, but it's definitely something that is worth considering. I think these are easy. Something else worth considering, once again, needs to be built correctly, are what I'm going to call these kind of hate artifacts, where I'm going to say Cursed Totem, Weathered Runestone, and Damping Sphere. And I've accidentally said it already, so I'll put Thorn of Amethyst in here. These ones, once again, doesn't quite matter who gets them, but what's important is that they're going to hate specific decks, and if that deck is on the table and this card gets exiled, one of your opponents will cast it. If someone is playing Elves, Cursed Totem will get played. If someone is playing Reanimator or some kind of cast from the library effect, or I guess bring from the library effect, they'll play Weathered Runestone. If someone is playing like a lot of increasing the mana of their lands tapping, or Storm, 2 separate decks that this one hits, someone's going to cast Damping Sphere. So all of this is particularly important, and I think these ones are really, really easy to play as well because they are all just artifacts at 2 mana that will hate a certain strategy really, really hard, and you'll be really happy to have access to them. Thorn of Amethyst also works for Storm decks, but I just wanted to add this because I really like this effect, because obviously I like Thalia, so I like this effect. I don't know if it necessarily belongs here, but it's dropped so much in price for a card that used to be $20+ that I thought I'd throw it out here just to remind people it exists. And then the last ones would be like Zozu, which would also go to damage, which is damage whenever a land enters the battlefield, or Dictate of the Twin Gods, which doubles all damage to all permanents and players. So, with all that in mind, I've given you a lot of extra cards here to play around. If you said, okay, Cursed, which ones do I play if I only play a few? Blood Moon is really, really hard for me to say no to. But otherwise, of these hate cards, I think the artifacts at 2 mana, these 3 here, you'll have the best time because they have the lowest cost, opportunity cost of playing, because you just get to get away with them. Whereas something like Back to Basics or Ruination, 1, your friends might not like you as much, but 2, you kind of have to rebuild your deck a lot more in order to get away with that. Other than that, I think definitely play Jace, Mystifying Maze. Those are really, really good. Oblivion Sower is good, and Passionate Archaeologist, if you can budget it, would be great. And I think that's generally where I'm going to end on this deck. I kind of went on to a different kind of direction. Wow, and I've been talking for 50 minutes, and so I think that deserved it. But I do like where the deck is. I think, and I talked about this before, and I talked about this at the start, Ian Malcolm is kind of hard to play, so there are limitations to how strong we can make him, but I think he's in a really, really good place, and I think we can be really happy with where he is. I'll leave it up to you to decide how mean you want to be. I really do like the kind of hate angle because it's very political, it's very interesting, and I think it allows for some really strategic plays between the players. All of a sudden, they're not just reaping constantly without sowing. You know, with Blood Moon as an option, all of a sudden they're sowing, and I really like that. And I think Blood Moon is the fairest of these cards in a lot of ways, because you can look at them and be like, hey, you still get to cast off of Ian Malcolm. Thank you so much, Lexa, for sending me this deck. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, please do. I'm interested to see how it builds. And if you want to send me that draft or any other draft, you can find the link in the video description. And if you could like, comment, subscribe, do that whole thing, I'd be very grateful. We are almost at 400 subscribers. It's mind-blowing, really. And I love seeing the channel grow. All right. Good luck.